Okay, on this particular video, I want to talk about the short answer question and the skill of contextualization. All of the examples that are in this particular video come from the AP History website, AP Central. Okay, first we're going to look at the task. We're going to look at the curriculum framework and look at an example topic for a question on contextualization. We have talked about in the past how all the short answer questions ask the writer to basically do the same skills again and again. And one of those skills is contextualization or interpretation, one or the other. Comparison is usually a skill used in all of the short answer questions, and of course supporting your answer with specific information. This particular question asks about a student's ability to provide context for two writings, to tell what happens historically as a result of two people's influence. And so in order to get a better understanding of exactly what contextualization means and is, I'm going to show you a little example from a museum that I went to one time, in which a headline, if taken out of context away from a particular article, that headline seems to have a different meaning. So this was taken at the museum in Washington, D.C. And if you take this as this headline alone, it sounds exactly like there's a panda giving a lecture at the National Zoo. However, in the context of the article, we know that there is actual expert giving some lectures about pandas at the National Zoo. So one of the things that we can try to remember about contextualization is that our goal is to look at the bigger picture and to put these words that these people are saying in the context of what's happening historically, what else is happening historically at the time, and to talk about how it affects American history, what kind of effects or changes occurred. So let's look at our question here. This is, we have two speakers, John Muir and Theodore Roosevelt. And so underneath the actual question, you will see your ABC. And it says in part A, again, we're going to explain an implication for public policy of John Muir's view on land use. In other words, we're going to take John Muir's words and we're going to put them back in that era of history, and we're going to find out or talk about what happened as a result. B, one way in which an implication for public policy of Theodore Roosevelt's view is different from that of John Muir. So again, this is the comparison skill, that we're going to compare both speakers and talk about how they're different. C, a specific example of land use policy from this period and explain how that is consistent with the view of one of those men. So this particular question asks you to do a lot of things, and you have to do it pretty quickly. Okay, so like any other question, short answer question, look and make sure that you're looking at names and dates and information to activate your knowledge. We know about Teddy Roosevelt. We know about the Progressive Era. We know about the role of government in cleaning up the meat industry. We know about Teddy Roosevelt's beliefs in conservation. And so those are the things that should be activated as you read those two men's writings. If I were a reader on this exam and asked to basically grade the responses, I would be given this score sheet. You can read through it and see the part A, the information that the reader would expect to read about as far as John Muir's views on land use, that he was a preservationist, and he wanted to preserve the land and regardless of what might be underneath that land. B, Teddy Roosevelt was more of a conservationist. That's how they are different. And he wanted to be sure that he was using the land as it should be used to help people, but that it was also conserved as much as possible. And then part C, we would be asked to come up with some of those pieces of legislation that support either Muir or Teddy Roosevelt. And there's some examples underneath part C. This is a continuation of Part C, where you can see that some of the information, you can go as far as up to 1945 with the Civilian Conservation Corps, as far as conserving land, and also the dam projects that come with the New Deal that do harness the power of water for the benefit of people's electricity. Okay, let's look at our sample responses. This is our first one who achieved a score of 3. You can see the rubric at the bottom and the justification for the scores. Part A, the student earned the point by explaining Muir's position, and it would lead to a ban on economic activities on restricted land. So, being a conservationist, Muir wanted to make sure that some land that remained untouched and totally preserved, like the Yellowstone Park area, in which Muir spent a lot of time visiting. Part B, the contrast to Muir's belief that Roosevelt was willing to go as far as leaving some land conserved or untouched, but also that some needed to be used for economic reasons. And then Part C, the student earned the point by identifying and correctly explaining the foundation of the National Park Service reflected Roosevelt's views, and you could have used any of the other land policy legislation like the Newlands Act. You could have talked about the Civilian Conservation Corps, which goes on later. Those are the types of things you could have used to support. This is score of 2 from this sample. The student earned the first point by accurately explaining Muir's intentions as being a preserver of nature. Part B, also the student earned the point because the student made the distinction that Roosevelt was more of a conservationist and not a preservationist, and he wanted to use some of those resources for the good of business and for people. And then Part C, the student sadly did not get this point because the student used a piece of evidence that was not a land policy. The student used Clean Air and Water Act, and that would not be the kind of support that the readers are looking for because we're talking about land policy. Last response received a score of 1. Student did not receive scores for Part A because the student did not interpret Muir's approach correctly, saying that Muir wanted to use land for economic use. B, also the student did not earn a point because the response did not contrast the 2 points between Roosevelt and John Muir. And then point C, the student did earn a point by using the Forest Reserve Act as evidence. So in this response, we can see how sometimes even if the student is unable to achieve the first 2 points to show the difference and to actually explain the viewpoints, the student can still achieve 1 point on the last part with specific factual information. In sum, contextualization questions require a writer to compare and also to put a person's words, and it's usually a short passage, in the historical era, and to talk about the bigger picture of what's going on. And in these passages we learned that we had a conservationist, Teddy Roosevelt, who was influenced somewhat by John Muir, and we also have John Muir being the preservationist, and he had a big influence on government policy with the passage of the Newlands Act, the Forest Reserve Act, and creation of the National Park System. Be sure that you support your answers with those specific events, answer that question, and good luck on your test.